Hello, it's Selena's Love Chronicles. Welcome to today's story, a tale of forbidden love, unspoken pain, and the power of a bond that defied the laws of two worlds. She was the rejected Omega no one wanted. He was the alpha vampire who broke every rule to claim her. Their love began a war, but also a destiny. Stay till the end, because this story will remind you that even in the darkest night, love still finds a way. Now, let's begin. The blood moon hung heavy above the valley, a red wound in the sky. Beneath its light, the pack gathered in silence, a living circle of fur and fury. In the center stood Arya Kalis, stripped of her title, stripped of her name. The cold air pressed against her skin, and the earth beneath her feet felt like a grave waiting to close. No one met her eyes. The same wolves who once ran beside her now turned their faces away, their loyalty chained to a leader who had already decided her fate. The Alpha spoke only once, his voice low and final. She was unworthy. Her bond rejected, her scent erased from the pack. The mark at her throat, once a symbol of belonging, faded beneath the moonlight like smoke. When it vanished completely, so did the last warmth she had ever known. She did not cry. The night had taken too much already. The hollow inside her chest was colder than the storm rolling down the mountains, and tears would have been a mercy. Arya turned from them and walked into the trees without a sound. The forest swallowed her whole, and no one followed. For hours she wandered through rain and mud, guided only by the dim pulse of the moon above the treetops. The wind howled between the branches, carrying whispers that sounded almost human, almost familiar. Her body ached, but what hurt most was the emptiness where the bond had been. It was said that when a mate's claim was severed, the soul cracked. She felt that break with every breath. The deeper she went, the stranger the woods became. The air thickened, rich with a scent she did not know, iron and frost, old as stone. Somewhere far off, a wolf cried out and was answered by silence. Arya stopped, her bare feet sinking into the moss, and for a long moment she simply listened. The forest was breathing around her, alive in a way that should not have been possible. She told herself she would keep walking until dawn. When the first light came, she would find water, build a fire, start again. She told herself many things, all of them lies meant to quiet the terror inside her, because even if she survived the wilderness, the rejection mark would kill her soon enough. No Omega lived long after being cast out. Lightning split the clouds above, lighting the path ahead in a burst of white. For an instant she saw movement between the trees, a figure, tall and still, watching her. When darkness fell again, the shape was gone, but the scent remained. It wasn't wolf. It wasn't human. It was something colder. Arya's breath caught. Legends spoke of the creatures beyond the valley, the ones her kind had sworn to destroy. Vampires, they called them. Demons with hearts of ice. But legends were stories told to keep pups close to the den. No vampire had crossed into wolflands for centuries. Still, the forest whispered otherwise. She pressed on, driven by instinct and fear, until her legs failed her. The ground rose and fell beneath her vision. The world tilted. She sank to her knees beside a stream and tried to drink, but her reflection stopped her. The girl staring back looked half ghost, hair plastered to her face, eyes rimmed red, a hollow where her mark had been. The pack had taken everything. They had left her to die. A sound broke the stillness behind her, a step deliberate and slow. She turned, but the forest yielded only mist. Then, through the veil of rain, she saw them, eyes faintly crimson, watching with the calm of a predator who does not need to hurry. The air around her shifted, colder now, scented with night and the faint sweetness of blood. She should have run. Every instinct screamed it. Yet something in that gaze held her still. It wasn't hunger she saw there, but recognition, ancient, impossible. The stories had never mentioned that vampires could look almost sorrowful. The figure moved closer, emerging from the mist. He was not cloaked in shadow, but in silence itself. His presence bent the air. The rain refused to touch him. Skin pale as moonstone, hair dark enough to swallow light. His eyes glowed like embers beneath ash. Arya could not breathe. He stopped a few paces away, studying her as though he already knew what she was. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, almost curious. The words carried no threat, only a strange inevitability. But she did not understand them. The sound was older than her language, older than her kind. Her knees gave way, and she fell forward. He reached out too fast for any mortal eye and caught her before she hit the ground. The touch was cold, but the moment his skin met hers, a pulse shot through her veins. Not pain, not fear, something that felt like recognition. The bond she had lost began to ache, as if answering a call it did not remember making. She tried to speak, but the world dimmed around her. The last thing she saw was his face, unearthly, unreadable, and the faint curve of sorrow on his lips. Then darkness took her. When Arya woke again, the rain had stopped. She lay in a cave lit by a single shard of moonlight. Her wounds were gone, her body warm, her heart beat steady. The scent in the air told her she was not alone. Beyond the mouth of the cave stood the stranger, watching the horizon where the moon bled into dawn. He did not move when she stirred, but she knew he had felt it. Every nerve in her body screamed that she should fear him, that he was the end written in every werewolf legend, yet the quiet inside her said otherwise. Somewhere deep in her chest, the void the pack had left began to fill, not with peace, but with danger. Whatever he was, he had saved her, and nothing in the world came without a price. The blood moon was setting, but its curse had already chosen her. The rejected Omega was no longer alone, and the night itself seemed to hold its breath. Morning crept through the mouth of the cave like a shy visitor, pale and trembling. Arya blinked against the light, her senses sharpened beyond their limits. The scent of damp stone and ancient earth filled her lungs. She was alive, though she did not understand why. Her body bore no wounds, her skin smooth where claw and rejection had once torn it. The figure who had saved her stood by the cave's edge, unmoving, as if carved from twilight itself. The light hesitated upon his form, unsure whether to reveal him or retreat. His presence bent the quiet around them, and even the air seemed to know his name. Arya did not, yet something within her recognized him all the same. He turned toward her, and she felt the weight of centuries in his gaze. It was not the stare of a man, but of a being who had seen empires fall and moons die. When their eyes met, she felt as though the world narrowed to the space between them. A chill ran down her spine, not from fear, but from the strange pull that linked her breath to his. Arya struggled to speak, but her throat ached with thirst. Her voice came out as a whisper, hoarse and uncertain. She asked him why he had helped her. He did not answer. Instead, he approached, steps soundless, stopping just close enough for her to see the faint shimmer of power along his skin. The air grew colder. The cave seemed to hold its breath. In that silence, he extended his hand, not in command, but in offering. The gesture was deliberate, almost human. His eyes, crimson at first, softened to something closer to sorrow. She hesitated, then reached out. When her fingers brushed his palm, a pulse of energy moved through her like a heartbeat that was not her own. The world dimmed and brightened at once. Her thoughts blurred, filled with images that were not hers. A fortress built in shadow, a moonless sea, 1,000 nameless faces turned to dust. His memories. For an instant, she saw what he had been, a king among the cursed, a ruler of a realm where night never ended. Then the vision vanished, leaving her breathless and trembling. He stepped back as though her touch had burned him. The silence stretched between them, heavy with questions she could not ask. She sensed something in him, a restraint, a battle beneath the calm. Whatever he was, he fought it for her sake. Outside, the forest stirred. The pack's hunters had begun their search, their howls echoing faintly across the hills. Arya's heart raced. She knew they would track her scent eventually, though faint now, mixed with the strangers. If they found her with him, it would mean war. The ancient treaty forbade any bond between vampire and wolf. Such a union was a curse upon both. The stranger's gaze shifted toward the distant sounds. He understood. Without a word, he turned and left the cave, stepping into the morning mist. Arya followed, drawn by something she could neither name nor resist. The forest bowed before him as he walked, branches bending away, shadows folding to his will. She realized then that he was not merely a vampire. He was something more, a ruler among them, bound by laws older than her kind could remember. They moved through the trees in silence until they reached a clearing where the mist thickened like smoke. There, he stopped and looked back at her. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes carried a warning. He gestured for her to stay hidden, then vanished into the haze. Moments later, the scent of wolves filled the air, sharp, feral, furious. Arya crouched behind a fallen log, her pulse pounding. She recognized the lead hunter's scent. It belonged to the beta who had once sworn to protect her. Now his loyalty belonged to the alpha who had cast her out. She heard his voice, low and cruel, as he ordered the others to spread out. They were close. The mist thickened again. Then came a sound, soft at first, like wind through dry leaves, then sharper. A whisper, a rush, and silence. The forest held its breath once more. One by one, the wolves' voices fell quiet, replaced by stillness. When Arya dared to look up, the clearing was empty. Only the mist remained, faintly red in the morning light. The stranger reappeared, his movements calm, his eyes now glowing faintly. No blood stained his hands, yet she knew what he had done. He looked at her not with pride or cruelty, but with quiet certainty, as if this outcome had always been written. Arya tried to step toward him, but her strength faltered. The air shimmered between them, alive with tension and the unspoken truth that she was now bound to him by something far beyond gratitude. The bond she had lost still ached, but a new thread had begun to form in its place, fragile, dangerous, and alive. The stranger studied her for a long moment before speaking for the first time. His voice was deep, but there was no malice in it. He told her to go back, to find another path, to forget what had happened. The words felt like a command and a plea woven together. But she could not turn away. The world she had known was gone. The pack would never take her back. Whatever future awaited her, it stood before her now, cloaked in shadow. He saw the defiance in her eyes and understood. Without another word, he turned and began to walk. She followed. As they disappeared deeper into the forest, the last light of the blood moon faded from the horizon. The night that had cursed her had also delivered her to something far more dangerous than rejection. The legends had not lied. Where vampires walked, death followed, but they had never spoken of what came before it, the quiet, terrible mercy of being chosen. By the time the sun rose, Arya Kaylis was no longer running from her past. She was walking beside it. The forest grew denser as they moved, the canopy swallowing the light until the world dimmed to shades of silver and gray. The stranger's pace was neither hurried nor slow. He moved as if time itself had surrendered to his command. Arya followed, her feet carrying her through roots and shadows she could barely see. Every step she took drew her deeper into his world and further from her own. She could feel the air changing. The pulse of the earth beneath her feet seemed to echo differently here. The trees whispered with voices older than her bloodline. Somewhere above, the last fragments of daylight vanished, and the world surrendered to dusk. She wondered if she had crossed an unseen boundary, one that wolves were never meant to cross. They came upon a narrow ravine where dark water glimmered between jagged stones. The stranger halted and looked across the stream. For the first time, Arya saw hesitation flicker through his composure. He stood perfectly still, yet his silence felt heavy, like the calm before a storm. She watched as he reached down and touched the water with his fingertips. The surface responded, rippling outward, glowing faintly crimson before fading again. It was a mark, a ward of power. This place belonged to his kind. Without warning, he turned to her, his gaze sharp and questioning, as though testing whether she understood the dangers she now faced. She did, but she didn't turn back. The corners of his mouth tightened, not in anger, but in reluctant acceptance. Then, without another glance, he crossed the stream. The water parted where he stepped, obeying him. Arya hesitated only a moment before following. When her foot touched a surface, the current bit at her skin like frost, and pain raced up her leg. Still, she moved forward. The moment she reached the other side, the chill subsided, replaced by warmth that sank deep into her bones. It was as though the earth itself acknowledged her crossing. They traveled onward, deeper into territory no living wolf had seen for generations. The forest here was unnaturally silent. Even the wind dared not stir. The stranger moved with certainty through the gloom until they reached an ancient ruin half buried beneath moss and stone. Arya recognized it from the stories her elders whispered, the stronghold of the Night Clans, lost centuries ago after the Great War. He paused at the entrance, resting his hand against one of the pillars. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the stone pulsed with faint light, and the heavy doors before them groaned open. Inside, the air was cool, still, and filled with the scent of forgotten ages. Shadows lined the high walls, each carved with symbols she couldn't read. The stranger entered first. His footsteps echoed softly, guiding her into the heart of the fortress. There, beneath the remnants of an ancient dome, stood a throne made of obsidian and bone. It was cracked with age, yet the power that radiated from it was undeniable. Arya stopped at the threshold, overwhelmed by the sheer weight of history pressing down on her. He turned toward her once more. "This is not a place for your kind," he said quietly. His voice carried the echo of countless battles, countless losses. "You cross a line that cannot be uncrossed." She met his gaze, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. "My kind has already cast me out. There's nothing left to lose." Something flickered in his expression, pity perhaps, or something deeper that he refused to name. He walked past her and stood by one of the broken walls, staring out into the endless night. His silence said more than words ever could. She realized then that he too bore the scars of exile. Time blurred, the sky beyond the shattered dome began to shift, the faint glow of dawn hinting at the horizon. Arya felt exhaustion tug at her, but she could not rest. Questions burned in her mind. Who was he? Why had he saved her? What power had bound their fates together? As if sensing her thoughts, he spoke again, his voice low, almost reluctant. "I should have let you die that night." The words struck like a blade, but his tone held no cruelty, only resignation. "Then why didn't you?" she asked softly. He turned his head slightly, the faintest trace of conflict shadowing his features. "Because fate doesn't ask for permission." The air between them grew heavy, filled with something neither of them understood. Arya felt it again, the strange pulse that had linked their touch in the cave. It beat once, twice, and then settled deep within her chest. Her breath quickened. Whatever had awakened that night was not done with them. He seemed to feel it too. He closed his eyes briefly, as though listening to a voice she couldn't hear. When he opened them again, the glow in his gaze had dimmed, replaced by quiet resolve. "You are bound to me now," he said, each word deliberate. "By blood, by the will of what sleeps beneath this world. You cannot return to your pack. They would sense it and destroy you." Arya's throat tightened. She hadn't realized until then how final her exile had become. There was no path back, only forward, into a darkness that both terrified and called to her. He turned away, moving toward the throne. "You should rest. The bond will demand its price soon enough." Arya didn't move. She stood in the fading light, watching the way his shadow stretched across the broken stone. She didn't know what that price would be, only that she was already paying it. Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying with it the distant howls of wolves. The pack had not given up their hunt, and now their search would lead them into forbidden lands. The moment they crossed the boundary, they would break the oldest law of both races. War would not be a possibility. It would be a promise. The stranger lifted his head, eyes narrowing toward the sound. He did not look surprised. Instead, he murmured something under his breath, ancient words that made the very air tremble. The walls of the stronghold seemed to awaken, faint lines of crimson light spreading through the cracks like veins. Arya realized he wasn't preparing for defense. He was summoning something older, something buried deep beneath the ruins. The ground beneath her feet began to hum. A vibration like a heartbeat echoed through the stone, pulsing in rhythm with her own. The bond between them was no longer silent. It called to her, demanding recognition. When the tremor faded, he turned toward her one last time. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of prophecy. "The world will know soon enough. A bond between cursed blood and forsaken flesh cannot exist without consequence. You are no longer wolf, and I am no longer alone." Outside, thunder rolled across the horizon, though no storm had yet formed. The first signs of war had begun to stir, and somewhere deep inside her, Arya felt the faint, undeniable truth. Their fates had already been written in the same line of blood. The fortress slept beneath the weight of centuries, but the air had changed. The vibration that had shuddered through its bones did not fade. It lingered, like a memory refusing to die. Arya stood in the Hall of Shadows long after the alpha vampire's words had fallen silent, her thoughts twisting through fear and wonder alike. The walls seemed to breathe faintly, exhaling the scent of dust and power that had not been touched by sunlight in an age. Outside, the first light of dawn was breaking through the fog, but it could not touch this place. The stronghold existed between worlds, caught in the seam where night and day refused to meet. The forest that surrounded bowed to an unseen presence, as though afraid to wake whatever slept beneath its roots. Arya's pulse still echoed with the bond's rhythm. Each heartbeat carried his power, threading through her veins like a whisper that was not entirely her own. It frightened her, yet somewhere deep within, it steadied her too. For the first time since her rejection, she did not feel hollow. The ache that had once gnawed through her spirit had quieted, replaced by something fierce and alive. She turned toward the cracked dome above, where faint streams of light danced against the dust. The air shimmered briefly, and she felt a stirring behind her. The alpha vampire had returned. His steps were soundless, yet the air shifted when he moved, carrying that same restrained storm she had come to recognize. Without words, he crossed to the far side of the hall and drew back a fragment of a tattered banner that still clung to the wall. Beneath it lay a symbol carved into the stone, a circle divided by 2 crossing marks. The edges glowed faintly when his hand touched it, illuminating the room with pale red light. Arya recognized it at once. It was the mark of war, carved into the fortress walls after the last treaty between their kinds was broken. She had heard stories of the ancient conflict, the rivers that ran dark, the moons that refused to rise for years. Wolves and vampires had nearly destroyed each other before the pact was sealed, a fragile balance born not from peace, but exhaustion. Now that balance trembled again because of her, because of him. The light around the mark pulsed once and then faded. The alpha vampire straightened, his expression unreadable. Arya could sense what he was thinking even before he turned toward her. He knew the meaning of this omen. The world had already begun to respond to their bond. Far beyond the fortress, the howls of her former pack echoed through the valley. It was not a call of mourning, but of anger. They had crossed into forbidden territory, and that single act would tear apart the fragile law that had held both races in uneasy truce. The hunters would not stop now. They would come for her, and in doing so, they would bring bloodshed. Arya closed her eyes, feeling the echo of their fury ripple through her bones. She had once been part of that voice, part of that unity. Now she was the reason it would fracture. The guilt pressed hard against her chest, but beneath it a quieter truth took root. She had not chosen this fate, yet it had chosen her. Whatever was awakening between them had been written long before her birth. The alpha vampire moved closer, the faint aura of his power brushing against her senses. It was no longer unfamiliar. It had become a part of her awareness, like a second heartbeat. She wondered if he felt it too, if the bond gnawed at his restraint the way it unsettled her thoughts. He looked beyond the walls, to the forest where the first scouts of her former pack would soon appear. His stillness was deceptive. Behind it, she sensed calculation, the quiet preparation of a predator who knew what was coming. The stronghold itself responded to him. The crimson veins that had glowed along the stone earlier began to stir once more, faintly flickering like embers waiting for wind. The fortress was waking. Arya's breath caught as the air thickened with unseen energy. Dust lifted from the floor, swirling through the light. Somewhere deep beneath the ruins, a low hum began to rise, a heartbeat that was not human, not wolf, not vampire, but something older. The entire mountain seemed to stir in recognition of its forgotten king. Outside, the forest cried out. Ravens scattered into the gray sky, and the faint sound of metal clashing reached their ears. The wolves had found the boundary and were tearing through it. Arya felt her stomach twist. She wanted to run to them, to warn them, but her legs refused to move. A cold understanding settled over her. It was already too late. The alpha vampire's gaze hardened. He had known this would happen. The law of blood could not be broken without consequence. He stepped forward, placing a hand against one of the carved pillars. The mark of war flared once more, brighter this time, spreading light through every fracture in the wall. The fortress came alive, its ancient defenses answering a call that had been silent for centuries. The ground beneath them trembled. Arya stumbled, steadying herself against a fallen arch. Her pulse raced, echoing the deep thrum beneath the earth. The bonds surged, filling her with a strength that was not her own. Images flashed behind her eyes, battles long forgotten, legions of shadows, the rise and fall of kingdoms built on blood. She could feel his history, his grief and his rage. It was endless. When the tremor ceased, silence fell again. The fortress had sealed itself. No mortal creature would cross its threshold now without permission. The alpha vampire turned toward her, his expression grave but calm. She saw then the weight of centuries etched behind his stillness. He had not wanted this war, but neither would he flee from it. He studied her quietly, as though deciding something. Then, for the first time, his voice softened. "What happens next," he said, "will change everything you've ever known." His words echoed through the chamber long after the sound faded. Arya didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. Somewhere beyond the walls, she could still hear the distant cries of her former kin, furious and lost. The forest had already begun to claim their lives. The alpha vampire walked toward the throne and stood before it, resting his hands on its cold surface. The crimson light around him deepened, wrapping him in the aura of command. When he lifted his head, his gaze met hers, not as a savior, not as an enemy, but as something far more inevitable. The war had begun, and she was the reason for it. Arya drew a slow breath, feeling the weight of destiny settle upon her shoulders. The world beyond these walls no longer felt like home. The path she had chosen, or perhaps the one chosen for her, would lead her through blood and shadow alike. Yet beneath the dread, a quiet fire began to burn. For the first time, she was not afraid. Outside, thunder rolled through the sky once more. It carried no rain, only the sound of awakening forces, ancient and relentless. Somewhere in that storm, her name echoed back, carried on the wind like a curse and a promise. Arya Kalis was no longer merely the rejected Omega. She was the mark upon which the next age would be written. The fortress stood in silence after the thunder faded, its ancient walls pulsing faintly with traces of light that moved like veins beneath the stone. Arya stood at the center of the hall, the last echo of the tremor still humming through her bones. She felt as if she had crossed another invisible threshold, one that neither time nor reason could undo. The alpha vampire had taken his place before the throne. His stillness filled the space with quiet authority, though his presence no longer felt entirely mortal. The air around him seemed alive, bending subtly to his will. Arya could sense that this place, these ruins, were not simply remnants of an empire long gone. They were a living monument, bound to him by forces older than the moon itself. Far below the fortress, something stirred. The hum deepened, resonating through the ground like a pulse growing stronger with every breath. Arya glanced toward the floor, her instincts tightening. She could feel it, a presence awakening from beneath the stone, vast and ancient, answering to the same bloodline that had saved her. Turned slightly, his gaze lowering to the earth. There was no surprise in his expression, only inevitability. "It begins," he said quietly, though the words were meant more for the unseen than for her. The hum rose again, and this time it carried a voice. 1,000 whispers layered upon one another, speaking in a language that felt like wind moving through hollow bones. The air turned colder, heavy with the scent of ash and old iron. From the shadows between the pillars, shapes began to emerge. They did not walk nor crawl. They drifted, pale and weightless, their forms half shrouded in mist. Their eyes were faint points of light, neither living nor dead. The shadow court had awakened. Arya stepped back instinctively, though she felt no threat from them, only an immense pressure, as if her very spirit bowed beneath their regard. These were the remnants of the First Covenant, the lords and rulers who had once governed the night before vanishing into legend. They surrounded the throne, their movements soundless, their attention fixed upon the one who stood before them. The alpha vampire raised his head, meeting their silent gaze. There was no fear in him. He had called them, and they had come. The whispering ceased. For a moment, all was still. Then one of the shapes moved forward, its outline clearer than the rest. The figure's presence filled the hall with cold authority, and when it spoke, its voice came not from a mouth, but from the air itself. "Thy bond has broken the law of blood." The words struck through Arya like a knife made of ice. Though they were not addressed to her, she felt the weight of them settle on her shoulders. The law of blood, ancient, absolute, had forbidden any union between their races since the first moon fell. She had not meant to cross it, yet here she stood, proof that destiny cared little for law. The alpha vampire did not deny it. His gaze held steady, unwavering beneath their judgment. The figure's light flared, and the whispering began again, soft, furious, like a storm beneath the earth. They debated among themselves, though the words were too old to decipher. Arya could feel the meaning in her bones rather than her mind. The bond between them had not only defied the old order, it had awakened something buried even deeper, a power that had lain dormant since the first war. The lead figure turned once more, its light dimming to a cold silver glow. "The threads of fate have tangled," it said. "The pact of night and moon lies shattered. What has been joined cannot be unmade." A tremor passed through the hall, and cracks spread through the floor. Dust fell from the ceiling like a slow rain. Arya felt her pulse stutter. The fortress was responding to their decree. The alpha vampire lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in recognition. The faint red aura that surrounded him deepened, blending with the silver light of the court. The merging of colors painted the walls with a shifting glow that looked like dawn breaking over ruins. When the voice spoke again, it was softer, yet filled with finality. "The curse of war returns. The bond demands balance. Blood will answer blood." Then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the figures began to fade. The light dimmed, their forms dissolving back into the shadows from which they had come. The hum beneath the earth quieted, retreating once more into the deep. The air grew still. Arya realized she was trembling. The court's presence had been overwhelming, yet what lingered in its absence was worse, the silence of something vast that had already decided the course of the world. The alpha vampire stood motionless for a long time after they were gone. The glow around him faded, leaving him in stark shadow. Arya could not read his expression, but she knew he had foreseen this outcome. He had called the court not to seek mercy, but to witness. Their appearance had sealed what prophecy had already begun. Outside, the wind rose again, howling through the valley. The storm that had circled the mountains now crept closer, its voice echoing through the broken walls. The first drops of rain struck the stone like distant footsteps. Arya turned toward the sound. She could see faint lights flickering in the forest below, torches moving through the darkness. Her former pack had come. The alpha vampire followed her gaze. His eyes glimmered faintly in the half-light, reflecting both moon and fire. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The air between them carried the quiet before the inevitable. Arya's heart tightened. She knew what those torches meant. Vengeance, not justice. They would not stop until every trace of her existence had been erased. Yet beneath the fear, a strange calm settled within her. The court's words echoed through her thoughts. What has been joined cannot be unmade. She understood now. The bond had not been an accident. It was a turning point written long before her rejection, before her birth. Whatever power had brought her to this place was not finished with her yet. The alpha vampire turned back toward the throne. The air shimmered faintly as he extended his hand toward her. It was not a command, nor a plea. It was a choice. Outside, the rain grew heavier, the storm swallowing the light. The forest below vanished beneath the dark. Arya took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the world shift around her. She stepped forward. When her hand met his, the light within the fortress reignited, red and silver entwined, brighter than before. The storm roared, the ground shook, and somewhere in the distance the first cries of war rose to meet the thunder. What the court had declared now began to unfold. The Shadow Court had awakened not to destroy them, but to bear witness to the beginning of a new era, one that neither vampire nor wolf could control. And as the rain fell upon the cursed fortress, Ariakelis became the symbol of a prophecy reborn, bound forever to the one who had defied eternity itself. The storm did not fade with dawn. It lingered, a restless shroud of clouds stretching across the mountains, muting the light into a dull, cold gray. Below, the forest whispered in uneasy rhythm, its shadows breathing as if alive. The wind carried a scent that stirred old instincts, iron, rain, and the sharp tang of blood long promised. From the high walls of the fortress, the valley below appeared endless. Thin trails of smoke rose through the mist, marking the path of the invading pack. Arya stood near the edge of the battlements, her cloak whipping against the wind. Beneath her feet, the stones still pulsed faintly with that strange dual light, silver and crimson, like the fortress itself had accepted her bond and claimed her as part of its living soul. Behind her, the alpha vampire moved with quiet purpose. He had not spoken since the night the Shadow Court appeared. His silence was not uncertainty, but calculation. He watched the valley the way one reads a prophecy already written, his gaze tracing every movement with calm precision. Arya could feel the growing tension in the air, the invisible thread pulling tighter between two worlds that could no longer coexist. The court had declared balance must be restored, and balance, she knew, was never achieved without sacrifice. She remembered the faces of those now coming for her. Wolves she had once trusted, trained beside, protected. Their loyalty had turned to fury when she was cast out. Now that same fury had found purpose. Her rejection had been the spark. Her bond with the alpha vampire had become the flame. Below, through the shifting mist, the pack moved like a dark tide, rows of armored wolves in their human forms intertwined, their formation precise and relentless. They carried banners marked with sigils of the crescent and claw, symbols that once defined her heritage. Each step they took echoed the judgment that awaited her. The fortress gates, untouched for centuries, now stood barred with heavy chains of shadowed metal. The air near them trembled faintly, as if the magic of the place braced itself for what was coming. Arya descended from the wall and entered the great hall once more. The remnants of the Shadow Court's presence still lingered, a faint shimmer along the pillars, whispers caught between stone and air. She could sense that they had not fully departed, only retreated into the spaces between time, watching. The hall felt alive with unseen eyes. As she crossed the chamber, faint tremors shook the floor. The storm outside had reached its peak, but this was not thunder. It was the echo of war drums, distant, methodical, closing in. The alpha vampire stood near the far archway. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something fierce in the stillness that surrounded him, a sense of inevitability that could not be avoided. Arya did not need words to understand. The hunt had begun. The first assault came not from the valley, but from the sky. Arrows of silver fire streaked through the storm clouds, raining against the outer walls with violent precision. The impact sent bursts of light scattering across the courtyard. The old stone groaned under the attack, but the fortress held. Arya felt the energy of the place surge through her, answering her heartbeat. The power that had once felt foreign now responded to her instinctively. The mark the court had left upon her skin glowed faintly beneath her clothing, an invisible link to the one who had saved her life and bound her fate. Below, the pack had reached the outer gates. Their voices rose in unison, a low, feral sound that carried through the storm. Lightning flashed, revealing their faces, warriors driven by vengeance, blinded by the belief that they were cleansing their world of a curse. The alpha vampire raised his hand. The storm hesitated, as though nature itself obeyed him. Then, with a slow exhale, he released the command that would change the shape of the battlefield. The fortress came alive. From every shadow, spectral forms emerged, ancient sentinels bound to the stone, remnants of the first night guard who had sworn eternal loyalty to their master. Their eyes glowed faintly red, their bodies made of smoke and armor that shifted with the light. They took their positions along the ramparts without sound, an army of ghosts ready to defend what the living could not. The first wave of wolves struck the gates. Metal clashed against enchanted iron. Sparks scattered like stars torn from the heavens. The sound was deafening, a collision of power that made the air itself vibrate. Arya moved instinctively, placing her hand against the wall. The fortress responded with a deep pulse, energy flowing into her like breath. The visions that came were fragmented, memories not her own. She saw glimpses of battles fought centuries ago, of oaths made in blood beneath a red moon, of alliances forged and betrayed. When she opened her eyes, the present had already erupted into chaos. The wolves had breached the lower barricades. The courtyard burned with silver fire, reflecting in the rain as embers danced upward into the storm. She moved through the corridors, her steps sure and silent. The power inside her guided the way, connecting her to every heartbeat of the living fortress. In the deepest chamber, beneath layers of stone and forgotten seals, she found what she had not expected, an ancient altar carved into the shape of intertwined wolves and serpents. Upon it rested a single blade. Its edge glowed faintly, neither of silver nor iron, but of something older, a weapon forged to end the first war between her kind and his. She understood what it was before she even touched it, the Blade of Equinox, a weapon that could either restore balance or destroy both bloodlines entirely. As she reached for it, the ground trembled violently. Dust cascaded from the ceiling. The clash outside grew louder, closer. The pack had broken through the first gate. Arya grasped the blade, and for a moment the world fell silent. The weapon recognized her, not as wolf nor as vampire, but as something new, a bridge between two worlds. When she rose from the altar, the light from the blade flared through the corridors, cutting through the shadows. The fortress seemed to breathe in response, its energy converging around her as if accepting her as part of its defense. Above, the alpha vampire faced the advancing army. His aura burned brighter than the lightning that illuminated the sky. When Arya emerged beside him, blade in hand, the storm itself seemed to bow. The wolves hesitated, caught between rage and awe. For a brief heartbeat, the world balanced on silence. Then the storm broke again, and battle consumed the valley. Arya moved like the storm she had survived, swift, precise, unrelenting. Every strike of her blade carried the weight of destiny. The wolves who had once called her kin faltered as they felt the strange energy that surrounded her. She was no longer bound by their laws. She was something beyond them, something that carried both moonlight and shadow. The alpha vampire fought beside her, his movements a blur of crimson light. Together they carved through the darkness, not as enemies of two worlds, but as symbols of one. As dawn broke faintly beyond the storm, the valley was littered with silence. The battle had ended, but not in victory. Both sides had fallen in equal measure, the field marked by the proof that the prophecy of balance had begun to take root. Arya lowered her blade, its light dimming with the rain. The alpha vampire stood beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the storm still lingered. The war had only begun, and the Shadow Court watched unseen. Somewhere in the distant mist, another force began to stir, older than either pack or bloodline, drawn by the power that had awakened in her. The true hunt was far from over. The rain fell through the fractured sky long after the battle ended. It washed over the silent valley, carrying away the ashes of what had been fought and lost. The fortress stood unbroken, though scarred. Its walls bore the weight of the night's violence, and its stones drank the blood of both wolf and shadow. Arya stood at the edge of the ruins, her cloak torn and darkened by mud. The blade she had drawn from the ancient altar still pulsed faintly in her hand, though the once bright glow now flickered like the dying ember of a star. Around her, the battlefield whispered stories of what had passed, the cries of the fallen, the rustle of the wind across abandoned armor, and the distant echo of something watching still. She could feel eyes upon her, not from the dead, nor from the wounded remnants of the fortress guard, but from somewhere older, hidden beyond the veil of the storm. The Shadow Court had not vanished after all. They lingered in the mist, unseen but not absent. When the clouds shifted, the moon appeared again, no longer silver, but a deep crimson veiled in haze. Its light cast the valley in strange color, painting every surface in blood and fire. It was not a moon of mourning, but of warning. The blood moon had risen. In ancient times it was said that when the moon bled, the balance of the world would begin to tip, marking the awakening of a force that neither wolves nor vampires could command. Arya remembered the words carved along the altar's base, forgotten runes that had burned briefly when she lifted the blade. She had not understood them then, but now their meaning pressed against her mind like a forgotten song. When shadow and moon share a single pulse, the gate between realms shall open again. The words filled her with quiet dread. The The war that had just ended was not the true conflict, it was only the beginning. Behind her, the fortress began to stir. The ancient sentinels of smoke that had defended its walls dissolved back into the stone. The air grew colder as the remnants of their magic faded. Only the alpha vampire remained at her side, silent and unyielding, watching the horizon as if reading the language of the clouds. His presence felt heavier now, not because of power, but because of consequence. Together they had survived the first clash, but survival was not victory. The pack had retreated, but only to regroup, and the Shadow Court's silence was never a sign of peace. Arya turned away from the field, her steps slow and deliberate as she descended into the inner chambers of the fortress. The corridors flickered with the faint glow of residual magic. Shadows followed her, stretching and curling like smoke drawn toward flame. In her chest, the mark that tied her to the alpha vampire ached with each step, resonating faintly with the pulse of the fortress. The deeper she went, the more the air changed. It grew dense, saturated with something ancient. She entered the library of stone, an immense hall filled with forgotten scripts etched directly into the walls. Every inch of it told fragments of history, wars lost, oaths broken, kings crowned in darkness. At the center stood a pedestal made of the same stone as the altar above. Upon it lay a single scroll bound by a ribbon of silver thread. The ribbon broke the moment she touched it, disintegrating like dust in sunlight. The scroll unfurled itself before her. Symbols she did not know at first began to shift and rearrange, forming words she could suddenly understand, as if some unseen hand translated them into her mind. The blood moon shall rise thrice, once to awaken the bond, twice to test its worth, thrice to claim its price. She read the lines again and again, feeling the meaning sink in deeper with every breath. The first blood moon had already risen. The bond had been formed, the bond between her and the alpha vampire, the joining of two forbidden bloodlines. The second, then, would test its worth. But what was the price? The chamber trembled faintly, a whisper of power stirring at the edges. The symbols on the walls glowed, revealing faint outlines of figures intertwined, wolf and shadow, moon and night. Their union was never meant to exist peacefully. The prophecy was not a blessing, it was a warning. Above, a low rumble echoed through the fortress. She knew that sound by now, the distant call of her old pack. The retreat had not lasted long. They were regrouping faster than expected. She could sense their rage in the wind, could almost feel their heartbeat thundering across the valley. She turned toward the stairway that led upward. As she ascended, she realized the fortress was no longer merely a stronghold. It was shifting, adapting, as if anticipating what was to come. The walls stretched, the towers reformed, even the air felt different, alive with quiet intelligence. When she reached the battlements, dawn was breaking. The crimson hue of the moon had faded, leaving the sky stained with gold and gray. The alpha vampire stood where she had left him, the wind pulling at his dark cloak, the faint glow of his eyes fixed on the valley. For a moment she studied the field below. The ground was scorched where magic had met silver. The bodies of the fallen had already vanished, reclaimed by the mist. The land itself seemed to be healing, though uneasily, as if aware the peace was temporary. She did not speak. The silence between them was heavy but not hollow. It was the silence of two beings bound by something neither had chosen but both now carried. In the distance, a faint cry broke through the wind, a lone howl, long and mournful, rising into the dawn. It was a sound she knew too well. Her old pack was calling, but not for truce. It was a declaration. The next hunt would not be one of conquest, but of extermination. Her gaze shifted toward the horizon where the forest met the mountains. For the first time, she saw what she had missed before, a faint, dark shimmer above the tree line, like a wound in the air itself. The gate between realms, the line between the world of the living and the shadow. The prophecy was unfolding faster than either side realized. The blood moon had already chosen its players. She lowered her gaze to the blade in her hand. The runes carved along its edge now burned brighter, alive with knowledge. They pulsed in time with her heartbeat. And beneath that rhythm, another pulse echoed faintly, deeper, older. It was calling her somewhere beyond the fortress walls, toward the place where the veil grew thin. The Shadow Court had spoken through silence. The next phase of their plan had begun. Arya understood now survival would no longer be enough. If she did not uncover the truth behind the prophecy before the second blood moon rose, both worlds would fall into ruin. And as she turned from the battlements, the clouds shifted once more. In the depths of the storm, far beyond the valley, a shape moved, massive, formless, ancient. Watching, waiting. The balance had begun to fracture, the air had changed. The storm had passed, but its echo lingered in the stillness, heavy with unspoken warning. The valley lay silent beneath the pale dawn, its mist curling through the charred remains of the battlefield like thin fingers of smoke. The scent of wet earth and cold iron clung to everything, even the wind. Arya descended from the battlements slowly, her cloak dragging against the damp stone. The fortress seemed to breathe around her, the faint hum of ancient power rising and fading with her every step. Though the walls stood unbroken, they no longer felt like a fortress. They felt like a sentinel, watching, waiting, listening. The blade in her hand had cooled, but its light still shimmered faintly along the runes that lined its edge. It was not a weapon that slept easily. It pulsed in quiet rhythm with her heartbeat, a reminder that the bond between her and the alpha vampire had deepened beyond choice. She carried not only her own fate now, but something larger, something that tied both of their worlds to a single, fragile thread. As she passed through the grand hall, she could still see the traces of battle. The floor bore deep cracks, and the scent of ash hung in the air. The echoes of what had happened there whispered faintly through the silence. Yet there was no regret in her heart, only the awareness of what still lay ahead. Outside the fortress, the horizon had begun to shift. What had once been clear forest and mountain was now marked by a faint distortion, a dark shimmer that bent the air itself. It was subtle but unmistakable, the veil that separated her world from the realm of shadows. The mark on her skin throbbed faintly, sensing it before her eyes did. The prophecy had warned her that when the first blood moon rose, the gate would begin to open. She understood now that she was being pulled toward it, not by command, but by inevitability. The alpha vampire had not tried to stop her. When she left the battlements that morning, his gaze followed her, but no words were spoken. Some choices were too bound by destiny to be denied. The path to the veil was not one of earth or stone. It wound through the dying forest, where the trees leaned inward, as though trying to guard secrets too ancient to be spoken. The mist thickened the further she went, carrying with it fragments of voices, not memories, not dreams, but echoes of lives lost between worlds. Her steps made no sound. The ground beneath her was soft, blanketed in layers of fallen leaves and old sorrow. As she walked, the air grew colder, sharper. The veil drew nearer. Then, through the shifting fog, she saw it, the Gate of Veils. It was not a structure built by hands, but a tear in the world itself, suspended between two ancient trees whose branches formed an arch of shadow. Within that arch, the air shimmered like water under moonlight. Colors that did not belong to the mortal realm bled faintly through it, silver, crimson, and a darkness that seemed alive. The gate pulsed once, as if recognizing her presence. The mark on her wrist burned in response. The blade she carried glowed faintly, its runes whispering words she could not fully understand. The prophecy's warning echoed in her memory, twice to test its worth. The test had begun. She stepped forward cautiously. The air near the veil resisted her at first, pressing against her skin with invisible weight. It felt as though the world itself questioned her right to enter. But the mark refused to yield. A faint surge of power rippled outward from her, and the gate opened with a sound that was not a sound at all, a deep, silent tremor that passed through her bones. Beyond it, the world was different. She stepped into a place without color, where the ground shimmered like liquid glass and the sky stretched endlessly in hues of gray and pale blue. Shapes moved at the edge of sight, forms without faces, drifting like smoke. The air hummed with strange rhythm, neither alive nor dead, but caught between. This was the realm of veils, the space between life and the eternal shadow. Arya walked forward, her reflection shimmering beneath her feet. Every step sent ripples across the glass-like surface, distorting the world around her. Time moved differently here. The wind carried whispers in a language she did not know, yet somehow understood. She saw visions flicker briefly across the surface below her. Memories not her own. The first war between wolf and shadow. The creation of the blood moon's curse. The first alpha who had dared to love beyond his kind, and the destruction it had brought. Each image flared and vanished like embers swallowed by the dark. She began to understand. The blood moon prophecy was not just about her. It was a cycle repeating across generations, destined to return until balance was truly restored. She and the alpha vampire were simply the latest to walk its path. The air trembled suddenly, and from the mist ahead, a figure began to take form. It was neither human nor beast, but something older. Its body was shaped from light and shadow intertwined, its face hidden beneath a hood of silver mist. The being carried no weapon, yet its presence filled the space like thunder. Arya's pulse quickened. She knew instinctively that this was one of the Shadow Court's emissaries, the ones who moved between realms, guiding or condemning those who crossed. The being raised a hand, and the ground beneath her feet shifted, forming symbols that blazed with light. Each mark pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. The blade in her hand responded, its glow merging with the light below. The emissary's voice filled the air, not in words, but in understanding. The bond she carried was being tested, not by strength of will or power, but by the truth of what she had become. The surface beneath her began to fracture, shards of reflection breaking away to reveal flashes of memory. Her rejection, her exile, the night she was saved, the war she had survived. Each image tested her resolve, forcing her to confront who she had been and who she had become. Pain surged through her as the mark on her wrist blazed like fire. The bond between her and the alpha vampire trembled, its strength pushed to its limit. She could feel his presence faintly, even across worlds, distant but unwavering, as if he too sensed the trial unfolding. When the light finally dimmed, she stood alone again. The emissary had vanished, but its mark remained, a faint symbol etched into the air above the gate, glowing softly like a promise. The trial had not broken her. It had changed her. The blade of equinox no longer glowed faintly, it burned bright, alive with purpose. The second phase of the prophecy had begun, and the test of worth had been fulfilled. But as Arya turned back toward the veil, she sensed something wrong. The air no longer felt still. The ground beneath her feet trembled. From the edges of the realm of veils, shapes began to emerge, dark forms that carried the scent of ancient hunger. They were drawn to her presence, to the bond that had now proven itself. The gate back to her world began to close. Arya ran, her steps echoing across the glass-like surface. The shadows pursued her, their forms shifting and tearing through the air. She reached the veil just as the first one lunged, its clawed hand striking against the invisible barrier. The gate burst open, light exploding outward. She fell through it, landing hard against the cold ground of her own world. The portal sealed behind her with a sound like thunder swallowed by wind. She lay there for a long moment, breathing hard, the blade clutched in her trembling hand. When she finally rose, the fortress loomed in the distance once more, its towers catching the faint light of dawn. The trial of the second blood moon was over, but the price for surviving it had not yet been revealed. The fortress had not changed, yet nothing within it felt the same. When Arya crossed back into her world, the sun had already begun to fade behind the mountains, staining the clouds in hues of copper and red. The light fell across the stone walls like a dying ember, trembling against the weight of an unseen shadow. She stood for a long while at the base of the fortress, her breathing uneven, her hands trembling as the last remnants of the veil's power dissolved into the cold evening air. The mark on her wrist no longer glowed, but it pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat that was not entirely her own. The bond had deepened. It no longer felt like a thread of connection. It was something alive, vast, and ancient. As she climbed the stone steps, the fortress seemed to breathe with her. Every arch, every wall carried the echo of her presence. The halls had become quieter, the torches burning with slower rhythm, as though the entire stronghold waited for her next breath. The alpha vampire had not left. She sensed his presence even before she reached the great chamber. The air there had a stillness that came only when two fates had crossed beyond undoing. He stood near the window, his form outlined by the dying light. For a moment, Arya felt the strange pull between them, unspoken, dangerous, undeniable. But beneath it, she sensed something else, the shift in the bond's balance. Something had been exchanged within the Gate of Veils. The power that bound them was no longer equal. Though she could not see it, she felt it clearly. The bond now carried a burden, one that rested more heavily on her than before. Each heartbeat seemed to echo faintly with his, but hers faltered every few beats, as though time itself had stolen a piece from her to strengthen the other. She didn't know that the emissary's trial had not only tested her worth, it had marked her as the bearer of the balance. For every wound the alpha vampire would take in the coming war, the bond would draw a portion of that pain into her. The prophecy had never been kind in its fairness. Night fell fully. The fortress walls seemed to dissolve into the dark, and the first pale shimmer of the moon crept across the valley. But it was not the same moon. Its light felt colder now, as if it carried the memory of what she had seen beyond the veil. The following days passed in silence. The bond had settled, but it pulsed through her body with unpredictable rhythm. She felt the alpha's strength within her veins at times, a surge of energy that came unbidden, fierce and burning. But it always faded, leaving behind a hollow ache. The wolves who still served the fortress began to whisper among themselves. They sensed the shift. The alpha's presence was different now, his aura heavier, his power steadier, but Arya's shadow stretched longer each night. There were moments when the bond flared without warning. Once, while walking through the lower halls, she felt her knees weaken as her pulse spiked violently. It was as though a blade had struck flesh, though not her own. Somewhere far beyond her sight, the alpha vampire had been wounded, and the bond had delivered a portion of that strike to her. The pain faded as quickly as it came, but its echo left her trembling. She began to understand the price. The bond had never been meant as a symbol of alliance. It was a seal of sacrifice. Every strength shared came with a wound to balance it. And as the blood moon cycle neared its final rise, that balance would demand more than either of them could afford. One evening, a storm gathered over the mountains again. Thunder rolled through the sky like a growl, and lightning split the clouds, illuminating the valley in white flashes. The wolves gathered at the fortress gates, restless and uneasy. The alpha vampire stood atop the northern wall, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Arya could feel his thoughts, distant, fragmented. He had seen something approaching, and then the scent came. The Shadow Court's emissaries had crossed into their world, not all, but enough to mark the beginning of the reckoning. The gate she had entered had weakened the boundaries between realms, and now the creatures of the Vale had begun to bleed into her world, drawn by the living bond she carried. That night, the first of them appeared. Tall forms cloaked in mist, moving like liquid shadows. They carried no weapons, yet the air around them burned cold. The wolves that faced them found their strength dimmed, their senses dulled by the strange energy that flowed from those beings. The battle was brief but brutal. The fortress walls trembled under the assault. The wolves fought with desperate ferocity, but their opponents seemed endless. Arya moved among them with the blade of Equinox burning bright, each strike scattering light across the darkened field. The weapon had become an extension of her will, its power drawn from the bond's strength. But every time she struck down a shadow, the mark on her wrist burned deeper, and she felt the life within her ebb slightly. She did not stop. By dawn, the invaders had fallen, their forms dissolving into mist that seeped back into the earth. But the victory was hollow. The air was heavy with the cost of it. The wolves' howls carried through the morning mist, low and broken. When the sun rose, Arya stood among the ruins, her strength waning. She could feel the alpha's heartbeat echoing faintly within her own, faster now, unsteady. He was weakening too, though he would never show it. The prophecy's second mark had been completed. The Gate of Veils had tested her worth. The bond had taken its price. And now the world itself had begun to bend under the weight of what they had become. The blood moon would rise again soon, and when it did, there would be no veil strong enough to hold back the truth that connected them. But truth, she knew, was never mercy. Arya turned her gaze to the horizon, where storm clouds were already gathering once more. Somewhere beyond those clouds, the Shadow Court watched, waiting for the final seal to break. The wolves whispered of omens, of stars vanishing from the night sky, of the rivers running dark, of the earth trembling beneath their paws. She knew it was not the end. It was only the beginning of what the prophecy had called the devouring dawn. And as the wind swept through the valley, carrying with it the faint echo of unseen wings, Arya understood that the bond she had forged would demand one final offering before the cycle could end. The first light of dawn had always brought warmth to the valley, but now it arrived shrouded in silence. The air was heavy with the scent of iron and ash, remnants of the night's battle still lingering like a haunting memory. No birds sang, even the wind seemed to hold its breath, as if the earth itself mourned what had begun. The fortress, once a symbol of dominance and unity, now stood fractured. Its towers leaned beneath the weight of unseen energy, and the stones glowed faintly with the residual shimmer of the Vale's curse. Every creature within its walls moved like a shadow of its former self, drained, watchful, uncertain. Arya stood at the edge of the northern rampart, her cloak fluttering against the rising wind. Her eyes traced the horizon where the last of the mist dissolved into the dim light. The pulse on her wrist still glowed faintly, a reminder that the bond she shared with the alpha vampire had deepened beyond mortal comprehension. It was no longer merely a connection. It was a conduit of fate itself. For the first time, she could sense his heartbeat even across great distance. It was uneven, heavier than before, yet laced with resilience. He was fighting to hold the pack together, to prepare them for what would come next. The mark throbbed once, and she knew the third phase of the prophecy had begun. The blood moon's cycle neared its final turn, and with it came the whisper of the devouring dawn, a phenomenon said to cleanse the realms through fire and shadow. Legends claimed it was not a sunrise but a consuming flame, one that fed on both light and life, reshaping the world according to the balance of those bound by the veil. In the days that followed, the fortress became a haven of unease. The wolves no longer hunted at night. The forests had grown strange and restless. Trees twisted unnaturally, their roots coiling through the soil as if reaching for something buried deep beneath. Rivers lost their reflection, and the stars above flickered with erratic rhythm. Every dawn felt slightly dimmer than the one before. Arya spent her nights in the high tower, tracing the sigils left by the emissary on the walls. The ancient markings seemed to shift under her gaze, changing shape depending on the light. Sometimes they pulsed faintly when her hand brushed over them, as though alive, watching, waiting. She tried to ignore the whispers that followed her steps, soft and distant at first, but growing stronger each day. They came from no single direction. They came from the stone itself, from the air, from the remnants of the veil still clinging to her spirit. The voices spoke in fragments, prophecies that bled through time. The bond feeds what it binds. The dawn devours its own light. One must fade for the other to endure. Their meaning was unclear, but she felt their truth in her bones. The deeper the bond grew, the more it demanded balance. Power came with a cost, and the bond was beginning to decide what that cost would be. One night, as a storm gathered once more over the valley, Arya's strength faltered without warning. The mark on her wrist flared violently, and pain rippled through her veins. Her vision blurred as the pulse echoed through her chest, one heartbeat too many, then too few. She realized it was not her body that faltered, but his. Somewhere beyond the fortress walls, the alpha vampire had faced another assault. The Shadow Court had found their path again, striking at the heart of the weakened pack. Every wound inflicted on him coursed through the bond into her. The connection that once gave her strength now became her torment. She collapsed against the cold stone, gasping for breath. The moonlight through the window fractured into shards, scattering across the floor like broken glass. Her shadow flickered against the walls, growing and shrinking with each pulse of the mark. The pain did not last long, but its echo stayed. When she rose, her reflection in the window had changed. Her eyes, once deep silver, now shimmered faintly with crimson at the edges. The bond was consuming her slowly, melding their essences into something neither wolf nor vampire, something forged by the Vale's will. By morning, she felt the shift in the air. The pack's energy was dwindling. The fortress had grown colder, as if preparing for abandonment. The Alpha's power, though formidable, could no longer sustain them all. The wolves began to look at her differently, not as an outcast anymore, but as a harbinger of something beyond their understanding. Rumors spread among them like wildfire. Some said she had become a vessel of the curse, others whispered that she was the key to salvation. None dared speak to her directly. Yet every time she passed, heads bowed, not in reverence, but in fear. Arya could not blame them. She feared herself as well. The following night, the wind carried a strange sound, neither a howl nor a cry, but something between them. It came from the forest, low and rhythmic, as though the earth itself chanted. The wolves grew restless. Even the fortress walls trembled with faint vibration. The mark on her wrist burned hotter than ever before. Then came the visions. In flashes of light, she saw fragments of what lay ahead, fire spreading through the valley, rivers of light turning black, shadows tearing through the sky like wings. And at the center of it all stood two figures, herself and the Alpha, facing a horizon ablaze with both dawn and destruction. The devouring dawn was not a moment in time. It was a convergence. The veil between realms would collapse entirely, and the world would be remade in the image of the strongest bond left standing. If they failed to control it, everything would burn. If they resisted, the bond itself might consume them. There was no victory in either path, only survival through sacrifice. The sun rose pale and cold the next day. The wolves gathered at the courtyard, silent and anxious. Arya descended from the tower, her cloak trailing across the stone. She could feel the weight of their stares, the tension coiling through the air like a living thing. She looked toward the horizon, where the light seemed to flicker unnaturally, too bright for morning, too dark for day. The dawn was changing. The devouring dawn had begun. The morning that followed was neither bright nor dark, but suspended somewhere between both. A thin haze cloaked the valley, turning every tree and stone into shadowed silhouettes. The air held the scent of rain that never came, and the sky hung heavy with clouds that glimmered faintly, as though light and darkness wrestled just beyond them. Arya stood before the main gates of the fortress. The wolves had gathered behind her, their eyes reflecting the dim light like molten silver. They waited for her signal, though none truly understood what awaited beyond the horizon. The devouring dawn had begun, and every heartbeat felt like a countdown towards something irreversible. The bond between her and the alpha vampire had grown unbearably strong. It no longer whispered, it roared quietly through her blood, an endless rhythm that set her pulse against his. When he moved, she felt the echo of it. When he faltered, the weakness spread through her limbs like shadowed fire. She had come to understand that their connection was no longer about power. It was about endurance. The prophecy was unfolding exactly as the emissary had warned. When the dawn devoured the night, the veil between realms would shatter. The world would be left bare, its truth unhidden, its balance undone. And the bond, if left unchecked, would consume them both. By midday, the first tremor shook the fortress. The ground quivered, sending dust from the stone walls into the air. Somewhere deep below, a low hum began to rise, a vibration that grew in pitch until it became a distant, trembling song. The wolves lifted their heads, their instincts sharpened by ancient fear. The veil was thinning. Arya felt it before she saw it. The air rippled before her eyes, bending light as though the world itself were melting. The sky cracked open, not with thunder, but with silence, a hollow stillness that swallowed every sound, and then the horizon split. From the fissure between worlds poured a storm of mist, black and silver swirling like a living tide. The Shadow Court had arrived, not as emissaries this time, but as conquerors. Their forms were neither solid nor ethereal, shifting constantly, their eyes gleaming like shards of starlight. The wolves braced themselves, claws raking the ground, but Arya raised her hand. The mark on her wrist burned with sudden force, and from her palm erupted a faint light, a remnant of the veil's power that still lingered within her. It spread outward, forming a thin barrier between her and the approaching shadows. But even that light trembled. The Shadow Court's leader stepped forth, a figure of impossible grace, his presence bending the air around him. Though Arya could not hear his words, she felt his intent to reclaim what the veil had lost. Her bond had become a fracture in the ancient order, and through it both worlds had begun to merge. The first clash came like a storm. The wolves lunged forward, their howls tearing through the mist, while the alpha vampire descended from the high ridge, his presence cutting through the shadows like a blade. The battle that followed was not of steel or claw, but of will. Power collided in waves, light and dark folding into one another until even the sky seemed to shatter under the weight of it. Arya stood at the center of it all, the mark on her wrist blazing. The bond screamed through her veins, pulling her toward him, tethering their strength. She lifted her arms, calling upon the last remnants of the Veil's magic. The runes along the fortress walls ignited, forming a circle of pale fire. The fortress itself became a beacon. For a moment, it seemed to work. The shadows recoiled, hissing against the light, their forms disintegrating into thin smoke. But then the sky cracked once more, wider this time. The sound was not thunder, but the tearing of fabric, the veil itself unraveling completely. A wind surged through the battlefield, carrying whispers from beyond the realm. The ground split open, revealing streams of light beneath the earth, pulsing like veins. Arya stumbled, but did not fall. She could feel the Alpha's heartbeat merging with hers again, faster now, more desperate. They were becoming one will, one pulse, bound by something stronger than fate. Yet with every surge of power came a price. She felt her strength draining, pulled into the bond to sustain him, to keep the light from collapsing. Each breath became heavier, the world around her dimming, as though her vision belonged to two bodies fighting to see the same sky. The Alpha's power flared, brighter and more violent than before. He fought through the horde of shadows, each movement echoing in her bones. But the more he drew from her, the weaker she became. It was a cycle that neither could stop. The shadow court began to chant, a soundless vibration that tore at the edges of thought. The mist thickened, swirling around the fortress, consuming the land. The wolves fought valiantly, but their strength waned against the unnatural tide. And then came the light. A surge of radiance erupted from the fortress core, the convergence point of their bond. It rose like a pillar, piercing the clouds, dividing shadow and dawn. The energy swept across the battlefield, dissolving the invading forms into fragments of dust. But even as the light spread, Arya felt herself fading with it. The bond demanded its price. She fell to her knees, clutching her chest as the mark seared through her skin. Her pulse echoed in her ears like thunder. The Alpha turned, sensing her collapse, but the light around them intensified, pushing him back. In that moment, the veil broke completely. The worlds collided, not in chaos, but in silence. Everything became still. The mist, the light, the fortress, even the wind, all frozen in the same suspended instant. Time itself held its breath. When motion returned, the battlefield was gone. The mist had vanished, and the valley lay quiet once more. The wolves were scattered, exhausted, but alive. The shadow court's remnants had faded into the air, leaving behind only whispers and ash. At the center of it all stood Arya, her form surrounded by faint luminescence. The mark on her wrist no longer burned, but glowed faintly with steady rhythm. The bond had not broken, but it had changed. She could feel his heartbeat still, softer now, distant yet present. The Alpha lived. But the link between them had shifted from power to something deeper, an echo of unity that transcended both their worlds. The veil had fallen, but it had not destroyed them. It had merely revealed what had always been hidden, that light and shadow were not enemies, but reflections of one another. As the dawn rose once more, true, pale, untainted, Arya gazed at the horizon. The sun's edge broke through the last remnants of cloud, casting long beams of light across the ruined valley. It was not a dawn of destruction, but of beginning. And though she felt the bond's presence within her still, she understood its new meaning. It was no longer a chain, it was a promise. One written in blood, shadow, and the unyielding silence that followed the fall of the veil. The dawn that followed the fall of the veil was unlike any other that had ever graced the valley. The air shimmered faintly, alive with the residue of power that lingered between realms. The sky had cleared, revealing a pale expanse tinged with silver and faint traces of violet. The fortress stood silent beneath it, scarred, fractured, but still standing. For the first time in centuries, there was no barrier between the world of beasts and the world of shadows. Both existed now within the same breath, bound together by a fragile, shifting balance. The cost of that unity, however, was yet to be measured. Arya awoke within the ruins of the great hall. The light from the open sky spilled across the shattered floor, and every fragment of stone reflected the faint pulse of her bond. Her body felt weightless, though her spirit carried the weight of entire worlds. When she rose, the first sound she heard was silence, the kind that comes after storms, when even the earth forgets how to move. The wolves who had survived lay scattered across the courtyard, recovering from exhaustion. Their fur was streaked with ash, their breaths shallow but steady. The alpha vampire stood at the edge of the broken rampart. His figure was outlined against the glowing horizon, his cloak moving softly in the breeze. Though their eyes did not meet, Arya felt his presence as clearly as the pulse of her own heart. The bond still lived. Yet something within it had changed. Where once there had been a constant hum of shared energy, now there was calm, steady, quiet, deliberate. The connection between them no longer pulled, it settled, like two rivers merging into one still current. She stepped forward slowly, feeling the echo of her strength returning. The mark on her wrist glowed faintly in response, a soft rhythm rather than the burning fire it had once been. She no longer felt consumed by it, it now resonated with her instead. The fortress bore the scars of the Vale's fall. Walls had crumbled, towers had collapsed, and the runes that once burned with energy now lay dormant. But beneath the ruin, there was renewal. The air carried no scent of decay. The ground beneath her feet pulsed faintly, as though the valley itself was alive, breathing again after centuries of silence. The balance between realms had been restored, but not without consequence. Whispers of the Shadow Court still lingered at the edges of reality. The veil might have fallen, but fragments of its essence drifted like smoke through the air. They were no longer enemies, but remnants, watchers from a world that no longer stood apart. The unity forged in the final battle had bound all existence into one fragile truth: light could not destroy shadow without destroying itself. As days turned into nights, and nights bled quietly into new dawns, Arya remained within the fortress. She no longer sought power, vengeance, or belonging. Her purpose had evolved into something quieter: guardianship. The wolves began to rebuild. They cleared the ruins, gathered food, and guarded the boundaries of the valley. Yet every time they looked toward her, there was reverence in their gaze. They no longer saw the rejected one. They saw the bond that had preserved their world. Still, she could not rest. The prophecy had not ended. Though the veil had fallen, one final verse remained, one that neither she nor the Alpha had spoken aloud. It was carved into the inner wall of the ancient library, the one place untouched by the chaos of battle. When shadow and light stand as one, the heart shall bear the burden of both. The oath must be given before the final dawn, lest the world collapse into silence once more. She knew what it meant. The devouring dawn had passed, but the balance it left behind was unstable. Without an oath to seal it, the harmony between realms would fracture again, slowly, quietly, until all creation unraveled. The oath demanded sacrifice, not of blood, but of will. It required one bearer of the bond to remain as keeper of the new balance, existing between realms, never fully of one, never fully of the other. A guardian who would carry the weight of both worlds until time itself erased the divide. The alpha vampire already knew this. She could feel it through the bond. Every time he turned his gaze toward the horizon, she sensed the same acceptance in him that she felt in herself. Neither needed to speak the truth aloud. They both understood it. On the eve of the 13th night since the veil's collapse, the sky began to shift again. The moon rose, pale and immense, glowing with faint traces of crimson at its edges. The mark on her wrist burned once more, not with pain, but with purpose. The final call of the prophecy had begun. She climbed to the highest tower of the fortress, where the last remnants of the ancient runes still faintly shimmered. From there she could see the valley stretching endlessly before her, quiet, reborn, alive. The wind carried whispers through the trees, and every rustle seemed to speak her name. The Alpha appeared beside her in silence, his presence a shadow against the moonlight. They stood together as the wind strengthened, wrapping around them like a tide. The world below seemed to hold its breath again, waiting for the final seal to be spoken. Arya closed her eyes. The bond pulsed once, then twice, syncing perfectly with the rhythm of her heart. The mark upon her wrist spread faint light up her arm, tracing lines of energy across her skin. She could feel the veil's remnants stirring, answering her call. She reached outward, not with hands, but with spirit. The air around her shimmered, the runes igniting one by one. The fortress trembled faintly, and the valley began to hum in response. Every living creature paused. Even the stars seemed to slow their motion. She offered the final oath, not in words, but in essence. The promise that light and shadow would remain intertwined, not as opposites, but as guardians of each other. That no realm would again rise to destroy the other, that the bond she carried would serve as the bridge between them, eternal and unbroken. The energy surged, rising in a great spiral that reached the heavens. The sky blazed briefly, every cloud illuminated from within, until the entire world seemed to glow with one pure light. Then, just as swiftly, it faded. Silence returned. The moon hung quietly above, its red edges now white once more. The mark on her wrist no longer burned. It had become part of her skin, a faint sigil that shimmered only when touched by moonlight. The Alpha turned to her, and though no words passed, she understood. Their connection would endure, but their paths had diverged. He belonged to the living world, bound to lead what remained of the wolves. She, however, was now the bridge, the watcher who would stand between realms, ensuring that balance never broke again. As the first light of true dawn rose, Arya descended the tower. The wolves bowed their heads as she passed, sensing that something sacred had shifted. She paused at the gates, gazing toward the horizon where light met shadow in perfect stillness. The world had survived its own unraveling, and though her journey had cost her everything she once was, she had become something eternal, a guardian not of bloodlines or power, but of balance itself. When the wind swept across the valley, carrying the scent of earth and renewal, she smiled faintly. The last oath had been fulfilled. The prophecy, at last, had found its peace. And in that peace, the world began anew. The dawn after the oath felt timeless. The valley lay quiet beneath a sky that had never looked clearer. The sun rose not as a conqueror, but as a silent witness to a world reborn. No storms raged, no blood stained the soil. What remained was stillness, the kind that spoke of both endings and beginnings. For 3 days the wolves rebuilt what had been lost. The fortress, once fractured by battle, now stood half-renewed under their tireless effort. Stone by stone, they laid foundations not only for shelter, but for a new kind of unity, one that no prophecy had foreseen. Arya's presence lingered like a whisper across the valley. Though her form was rarely seen, her essence could be felt everywhere. The breeze that moved through the forest carried her calm. The moonlight that touched the river bore her quiet strength. To the pack, she had become more than a memory. She was the unseen guardian who watched when the world slept, ensuring that neither shadow nor light ever tipped too far. The wolves began to call her by a new name, the keeper between dawn and dusk, but for the alpha vampire, her absence was heavier. He walked the borders of the valley each night, following the faint hum of the bond that still connected them. It was weaker now, distant, like hearing a melody through water, but it was enough to remind him that she still existed, somewhere between worlds. At times, when the moon reached its highest point, he could feel her presence most clearly. Not as sight or sound, but as warmth, an echo of all they had endured. Those moments reminded him that though fate had divided them, it had also bound them in ways no curse could undo. The valley itself changed under the new balance. Forests grew denser, rivers brighter, the very air sharper and cleaner. Night creatures no longer hid from the sun, and day-born beings no longer feared the dark. The two worlds had merged into harmony, creating a landscape that pulsed with shared energy. The wolves hunted beside the night-born guardians, who once were their enemies. Together, they patrolled the boundaries of the valley, protecting it from what lay beyond. Old grudges faded, replaced by something rare, trust. Yet beneath the peace, the Alpha sensed something stirring. It began as a whisper in the wind, faint and easily dismissed. But as the days turned, it grew louder, a pulse from the edges of creation. It wasn't evil, but it wasn't natural either. It was imbalance, the inevitable response of the universe to change. No bond, however sacred, could last without challenge. Balance was not stillness, it was motion. The worlds, now joined, had begun to shift again, seeking a new center. He knew then that the prophecy had never truly ended. It had only changed shape. The Alpha stood once more on the tower where Arya had given her final oath. The marks she had left behind still glowed faintly upon the stone, their light soft and unyielding. He touched them, and for a heartbeat the air shimmered, revealing her form, faint and translucent, standing before him. Her expression held neither sorrow nor joy. It was peace, the kind that exists only when all debts have been paid. He did not speak, he only listened. Her voice came not from her lips, but from the air itself. The world breathes because we chose to bear its weight, but balance is not meant to be guarded, it is meant to be lived. Then her image faded, dissolving into motes of light that drifted toward the horizon. He understood her meaning. The time for guardianship had passed. The worlds did not need watchers, they needed freedom. The balance could not depend on the weight of two souls forever. It had to live within every being that walked beneath the same sky. So he gathered the wolves, the Nightborn, and the surviving elders of both realms. Beneath the full moon, they formed a circle at the heart of the valley. There, he spoke what would become known as the new oath of the dawn. Let no blood divide what the earth has joined. Let no night fear the sun, nor day curse the dark. We are one breath, one pulse, one boundless truth. The balance lives in all, and all shall guard it. As his voice carried through the night, the air shifted once more. The faint shimmer of the veil, the last remnant of the old world, rose above the valley, glowing with silver light. It did not close, nor vanish. It simply became part of the sky, a thin line of radiance where shadow met morning. That night marked the beginning of the era of the Twin Realms. Generations passed. Stories of the Great Veil became legend, then myth. Children were born with both the calm of night and the fire of day in their eyes. Villages grew around the valley, where wolves and Nightborn lived as kin. But some nights, when the moon hung perfectly between silver and gold, travelers swore they saw a figure walking the ridge above the fortress ruins, a woman with eyes that glowed faintly like the stars. She never spoke, never interfered, but wherever she passed, the wind carried peace. Those who followed the legends said she was the keeper, still watching, still ensuring that the balance endured. And in the heart of the valley, where two worlds had once clashed, the earth continued to hum, a steady rhythm, eternal and alive, the same rhythm that began with a rejected soul and an Alpha who refused to let destiny decide their fate. The story of Arya and the Alpha vampire was never written in books or carved in stone. It lived instead in the pulse of the land, in every dawn that rose without war, and in every night that fell without fear. It became the breath of the new world, a reminder that even the most broken bonds can forge the strongest peace, and as long as the moon rose to meet the sun on the horizon, the balance would never fade. Because the keeper between dawn and dusk still walked unseen, not as a ghost, but as the heartbeat of the eternal balance itself. When the last moon fell silent, the story of a rejected soul and a forbidden bond became more than legend. It became the heartbeat of two worlds reborn. They began as enemies, torn by fate and law, yet ended as the reason the world still breathed. What was once war became balance. What was once pain became peace. Some say the story ended the day the keeper vanished into the light, but those who listen closely know the truth. The bond never died. It lingers in every whisper of the wind, in every heartbeat that dares to love against all odds. And somewhere beyond the veil, where dawn and dusk meet without end, two souls still walk together, not as Alpha or Omega, not as vampire or wolf, but as one eternal pulse that defied the darkness. Because true love never fades, it simply changes form and waits for the next story to begin.